Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's P&G Alumni Network webinar series. This is your host, Ileana Rojas, and I'll be emceeing for you today. And I'm very excited for our host today, Rania Anderson, who will be sharing with us why our business and diversity initiatives are not advancing. But before I pass on the baton to Rania, let me take you through a couple of announcements on how the web series works. This is a monthly series where our goal is to connect members and provide enriching content where we hope you learn something new and leave you inspired. And we do this by leveraging the expertise that we have within the network. Our webinars are also recorded so that you can go back and review anything you want to listen to again or share with your friends via our P&G Alumni Network YouTube channel. All of this is part of a bigger mission of the P&G Alumni Network, which is a nonprofit founded by former P&G employees to share ideas, talents, and resources with each other, our communities, and philanthropy efforts. With more than 35,000 registered members in 45 chapters worldwide, the P&G Alumni Network is officially recognized and supported by P&G. We connect via global conferences, local chapters, industry events, and online content. Our nonprofit foundation supports economic empowerment initiatives in communities around the world. And if you're not aware already, our 2019 Global Conference is in Madrid, Spain, set for October 24th through the 26th. Our last conference was held in Cincinnati in October 2017 and was a huge success, attended by alums from all over the world, including inspiring and thought-provoking speakers and breakout sessions and workshops. We hope to see you this coming October at our next conference to be held at the Intercontinental in Madrid. You can find more information on the network's website at pngalums.com, which, by the way, just recently relaunched a couple of months ago. So if you haven't checked it out, I invite you to do so. And I also invite you to register to receive P&G Alumni Network newsletters and emails where you will receive more information about the global conference as well as other exciting events from each of the chapters near you. Now, a couple of notes on the webinar logistics. This is your webinar screen. This is where you'll see content, polls, slides, etc. And one thing you won't see is webcams. To the right, you'll also see the control panel. You'll notice that your line is muted to avoid hearing dogs barking in the back or other distracting noises. But don't worry, if you have questions, you'll still be able to ask them through the control panel at any time through the webinar, and we'll have time towards the end of the webinar to go through them. Now, note that know that I may not be able to go through all the questions. They're only visible to me, and I do apologize beforehand as I may not be able to get through them, but I will do my best. Now, before I pass it on to Rania, we are actually going to have a poll for this one. So I want to go ahead and launch the first question. And if all of you can just answer, you should see the screen going on right now. And do you work in a D&I role or HR role should be the first question. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer. Perfect. Most of you have voted. That's awesome. Yes. Okay, so I'll close that one. And then the second, that was an 86% no. And then I'll launch the second one. What motivated you to sign up for this webinar? And you should see the poll going up right now, and I'll give one more minute just to answer those questions. And in the meantime, as soon as this is over, I'll pass it on to Rania to start the webinar. And most people have voted. Awesome. So I'll close it up right now. So 55% have a general interest in the topic and 32% have direct D&I responsibility. Okay, thank you everybody for voting. And I'll pass it on to Rania. How are you?
I am great, thank you. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk with everyone today about this important topic. And Ileana, are we good? Should I proceed?
Yes, we're good to go.
Great, thank you so much. So I don't buy that the lack of progress in terms of diversity and inclusion in our businesses is an intractable problem, that it is okay that we're not getting the kind of progress that we should be getting given the efforts and resources that we pay attention to it. So I want to talk today about why I think we're not getting that progress and what we can do about it. Just a little bit about my background, because I think it'll help shape the conversation. I'm formerly a banker, so I started my career at Bank of America lending money to businesses. And it is through that lens of what makes companies successful that I approach my work. And the culture and the management team and the makeup of an employee base is obviously critically important to whether a company is successful or not. And I left banking in 1997. I became an executive business coach, and I've been doing that work since that time, coaching primarily men, but more and more women in the past few years around their success as leaders in businesses. And then in 2010, I embarked upon a global research project that took 4 years, interviewing women in emerging economies around the world about their pathway to success. What did it take for them to be successful in Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East? And I wrote my first book, which is Undeterred: The 6 Success Habits of Women in Emerging Economies. And so my work was really coaching and doing what I would term women's leadership development on a global level, specifically in emerging markets. And then just a few years ago, as I continued to do that work, and it really happened first at Procter & Gamble in Mexico, men approached me about why people like me spend all our time teaching women how to work better with men, but never men how to work better with women. And why there were so many efforts around helping women to figure out how to advance, but no efforts really around how leaders and managers and men need to work with a changing demographic population employee base. And it was through those questions that I got primarily from male leaders literally all around the world, that I began to think about this topic and do a lot of research around what was happening. Why had we basically left men out on the sidelines in this journey around advancing women? And that eventually led to my most recent book, which was published late last year, called We, Men, Women, and the Decisive Formula for Winning at Work. And that's really about how men and women can work more effectively together, and what are the individual actions managers and leaders can take to recruit, retain, and advance women. So it's through that lens that I come to this topic, and it's through those interactions, both evidence-based research and my own interactions, consulting and coaching with businesses, that I've come to this frame and this view that I'd like to share with you today. I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to talk about the business case, why diversity and inclusion is important. I think many of us already know this, but it's just a really quick recap. And then 3 reasons why we're not making progress and what we can do about them. We know that gender balance and diversity and inclusion are a competitive business advantage, and I'll talk about the data that shows us that. I'm going to talk both about gender balance and diversity inclusion. My expertise really is more in the gender balance area, but I'll keep referring to both. So here's what we know the data shows us, that companies who have more inclusive cultures are more likely to meet their financial targets, be high performing, more agile, and that they have an increase in their ability to earn money, profitability, and have a higher return on equity. We also see through the research that there's a penalty for the lack of diversity. In other words, companies who have a lack of diversity, when we look at those businesses' performance, bottom line performance, they are more likely to be in the lowest quartile of companies in their sector. I want to take just one example. I know there's probably people on from all over the world, but I just want to look at the US and paint the picture of what's happening. So we have 7.6 million job openings in the United States today. We don't have 7.6 million people looking for jobs. And even if we did, there's a skill mismatch. We have baby boomers retiring. We have women who are earning 60% of advanced degrees. Millennials and Gen Z going to be the largest pool of employees that we are drawing from, and they're very diverse. And they're going to comprise most of our workforce, and they list D&I as one of their top 3 criteria for choosing where they want to work. Furthermore, in the United States, we have one of the lowest participation of women in the workforce. So as you can see, it's like a huge choke point, and limiting our ability to hire, recruit, and retain diverse employees and women, it would hamper a company immeasurably. Frankly, I don't know how anybody could not be focused on this market. So highest performing companies do much more to advance women than lower performing companies. And this is a really interesting piece of data that just came out. What we found is that if a business believes that gender diversity and inclusion are important to their business, they will benefit from it because they view their business through that lens, and they work towards that effort, and they work to bring in diversity of thought into their processes. But those who don't believe it's true really are not benefiting. They just, are naysayers. They're not actively figuring out how to make a more diverse and inclusive workforce work for them, and they're not going to see the same sorts of benefits. So just in a recap, the World Economic Forum and McKinsey estimate that if we could just have some improvement in gender equality in the workplace, we would get an increase in return of $12 trillion in GDP, an additional $12 trillion in GDP by 2025. So for businesses and for our economy as a whole, there's a huge dividend that we could gain. So that was a quick summary of that. So while we have all this data, mountains of evidence and data, we're actually not making any progress. In the United States alone, we spend $8 billion a year, that's with a B, and we haven't made any progress in terms of the number of women in senior leadership roles and in executive leadership roles. In fact, according to the World Economic Forum data, the United States has dropped from 23rd out of 144 countries in terms of the gender gap. 12 years ago, we were 23rd, and last year we had dropped to 49th place, so a massive drop. And the World Economic Forum, looking globally at what was happening in terms of closing the gender gap, recently added 47 additional years to their prediction of when we would close the gap and it now stands at 217 years. Recently, a CEO was asking me, isn't this problem going to solve itself? Now that we have more women and more diverse people in our population, more educated women, isn't this going to eventually just solve itself? Well, it isn't solving itself, and it's actually, we're stalled and going backwards. So what's the problem? Well, part of the problem is who's been trying to drive the car on their own, and the second part of the problem is who's been involved in the process. And I want to talk about both of those things, but before that I do that, I want to ask you to think about, what's the business case for the status quo? We don't really ever ask that question. When I come into a company, I'm always asked to show the business case for diversity and inclusion or gender balance. And I often ask the executives and the leaders to think about, what's the business case for keeping things the way they are? What is the benefit of that? So, what's missing? What would make us really make some progress? So the first thing I want to talk about is that best-in-class companies have moved from focusing primarily on what I call fixing the women and move towards an integrated solution. So when we look at what we've been focused on, we've been focused on what are the things we need to do so that women can make themselves more successful. We do a lot of women's leadership programs. We do women's ERGs. We talk to women about their lack of confidence and competence. We have a lot of coaching for women. We have mentorship programs for women. And those are really important things, but they're only one part of the equation. When women are leaning in, which they are leaning in, what are the people who are seated at the table with those women doing? What is the action they need to take to make the vehicle move, to advance really where we are? So from my perspective, there are three things that are missing. Companies don't really have a vision for an equitable workplace, what that really looks like to them. We don't use an integrated approach to strategically manage D&I. And then we haven't engaged men, managers, and leaders to take individual proactive and intentional action. I cover each of those and talk a little bit about some solutions. So in terms of the first one, the lack of ability to envision, when I talk to businesses about their D&I initiatives, they talk about, most of them will talk about certain goals or metrics. A lot of them talk about being on a D&I journey, and I'm never clear about that. I've never heard a CEO or an executive team talking about being on a sales journey or a quality journey or a safety journey. So I don't understand why we're on a D&I journey rather than we have a place we're trying to get to. We can specifically measure it and we know exactly what it will look like when we get there. It's this lack of vision that I believe doesn't give people the place where they're going so that they can figure out how to get there. Even if they can articulate, we want to have 30% women on our board or 50% women on our leadership teams, I don't think that they've thought about how will their business look differently and what would it be like to work there if they really had a diverse and inclusive culture. And that inability to articulate what that is for all the employees to really be excited about is a factor of what's holding them back. The drawing that you see on your screen is just an illustration in my mind of what it could look like, where you have maybe co-CEOs, your revenues and profits are up, your employee turnover is minimal because people feel like they belong and they're included and they feel very satisfied, and it's 6:30 p.m. and everybody's gone home for the day, nobody's working late. So that's just a very simple way to begin to think about how does it look when we have an equitable culture. So I think that's the first part. The second is that if we think of diversity and inclusion as having the business impact that I showed that it has in the early part of the presentation, then how come we don't manage it like any other business imperative? Mercer recently did a really amazing look at what are the diversity inclusion tools that are out there in the marketplace, and they identified hundreds of different tools. There are some that are focused on candidate selection, there's some focused on employee engagement, there's some that are focused on monitoring, some are focused on ERGs. There are lots of technology solutions, there's lots of consultants doing different things. And when I talk to companies, what I see is that the diversity inclusion budget has, if there is a budget, they're using it in disparate ways, and they're trying an action here and an action there and a strategy here and a strategy there and a speaker here and a speaker there and an employee resource group here and a women's leadership program there. But it isn't a comprehensive, cohesive strategy where all the parts are linked to the strategy and we know how they're working together. Why is that? Well, here's some interesting data about what kinds of resources companies have. 47% of companies have a diversity leader. Most of those people are in new roles. Those leaders don't have adequate demographic data to be able to look at what's happening in their organizations. They are not sure what to measure and how to measure it. So a business would never allow that to be the case for other business imperatives like global expansion or sales or quality. But yet we permit this scenario to exist in terms of our diversity inclusion initiatives. So I want to give just one example of a platform which is called Our Office, and I'm just using this as an illustration of a way where you would bring all of these efforts to bear, where you would think about what is it that you want to measure? What is the vision of where you're trying to get? You would be able to drill down on that data, figure out what actions you were going to take and how those actions were related together. Everyone would be involved in driving actions towards D&I initiatives and objectives. It wouldn't be just the responsibility of D&I and HR. So, an example that I think a lot of people are familiar with is using Salesforce to drive sales, where everything is being done through that platform, and we can see what's happening. And that's my thought around, if we managed our D&I efforts in the same way, I think we would see a much greater improvement. So the third thing I want to talk about is what else is happening. So recently, we've seen more and more CEOs sign diversity and inclusion pledges or make public commitments around what they want to do in terms of diversity and inclusion. We've even seen executive teams and senior leadership teams more involved, at least verbally involved or in putting together some events. But what we haven't seen is the engagement of managers and employees at all levels of the organization. If we ask them if it is their responsibility, the answer is usually no. They think it's the responsibility of executives or HR or diversity inclusion. In other words, it's the responsibility of the company rather than themselves. And their actions trump the actions of the company. Why is that? They either don't know what their role should be and what the positive impact is, they don't believe that it will have an impact, or they don't care about it, or they're afraid that they will be displaced if they are the person who has the position of power and authority and privilege. They could view that this move towards a more diverse and inclusive workforce in their business means that they are going to have less power, that they are going to have less opportunity, and so they're not supportive of the efforts. So what do we do about that? How do we engage everyone and bring them off the sidelines and help them identify what actions they can take themselves and how that benefits them? My research really was around looking at what are the types of actions individuals can take and what high-performing managers can do. And this really forms the basis of my book, We, Men, Women, and the Decisive Formula for Winning at Work. So this is a behavioral framework that I developed based on both observing and working with leaders, working with companies, and then looking at the evidence-based research. And what I found was there are actions that we need to take to eliminate barriers. There are ways that we can expand how we interact. There are ways where we can encourage women and minorities to advance. And then lastly, in the ways that we engage. And I'm going to take each of these 4 buckets of behaviors and talk a little bit about each one of them. So I think we spend a lot of time in this eliminate category, but the question for an individual, for you on the phone, for anyone that you're interacting with is, am I aware of and personally address negative situation? In other words, do I clearly see the environment in which I work in? Do I clearly identify that there are things going on that make it harder for some people to do their best work and be the most successful? Obviously, sexual misconduct and bias, blatant bias, are clear indicators of this. And even those, I think sometimes we don't see. But I want to talk about more subtle things that I don't see leaders being as aware of or managers being as aware of. And I'll use an example. So if a management team typically has meetings that start at 7 or 7:30 in the morning just as a random course of action, then the likelihood is that those meeting times are more difficult for the women on the team to make than they are for the rest of the people. Why? Because women still have primary responsibility for childcare, home care, elder care, etc. So if we have practices that we haven't thought about, well, why do we really do that? And how does that practice negatively impact someone in my business? And could I do something to change it? Then those barriers remain and make it harder for people to want to come and work for us and to stay to work for us. Obviously, if there's a reason to have 7 a.m. meetings because you have a global team and that's the only time that makes sense for everyone, then obviously that's the case. Or if there's a crisis or there's a need for that, then you would have that. But looking at each practice and thinking about, does this practice adversely impact others in my business? and what could I do about it? These are things, the types of actions that I'm going to talk about now that don't require money or require the engagement or endorsement of the company at some broad and significant level. These are actions that any of us can take to change the environment. The second is, what are the ways that I can expand my interactions with women or minorities and provide the same opportunities that I currently provide to men? What do I mean by that? When we look at the fact that most leaders and managers today still are men, and if those men are mostly having lunch and talking to and brainstorming with male colleagues, then their female colleagues are interacting less with them. Those managers are benefiting less than they could be because they're not having those interactions. Those women are adversely impacted because they're not having the same access to management, and they don't have the same opportunities to show what their skills and contributions are. So it's thinking about, who am I spending my time with? What kinds of conversations am I having with them? When I have a question or a problem, who do I go to? And then when there are opportunities to get on a task force or to have a client engagement or solve a difficult problem, who do I give those opportunities to? Do I automatically think about the people that come to mind, the people that I'm interacting with, and so I give them the assignment, again, adversely impacting women or minorities? Or am I thinking about my entire employee base? Recently, I was talking to a partner at a law firm and asking him about how he assigns more junior lawyers, attorneys, to certain high-profile cases. And he said, well, oftentimes, as I'm walking around at the end of the day and I'm thinking about those cases, and I'll see someone and I'll remember them and I'll go talk to them about that case and I'll assign them to the case. And I said, well, about what time do you typically do that process? He goes, 6:30, 7 p.m. at night. And I said, are your female attorneys there still at that time in the same numbers that your male attorneys are? He said, no, most of them have gone home and they might get online later. And so actually you're forgetting about them? Yeah, I guess you could say that, right? So do we forget about some of our employees? And then how do we recruit? When I look at how companies recruit, the types of ads they write contain language that is not attractive to women wanting to come work there, that makes people feel like it's not an inclusive work environment, that the qualifications that are being asked for are so significant that they need not apply. So here's an interesting piece of data. Women do not apply for jobs, typically do not apply for jobs unless they meet 70 to 80% of the qualifications, whereas men will apply for jobs where they meet 50 to 60% of the qualifications. So if the way you list your job openings is to put every last thing that you might possibly be able to find in an employee or in a candidate, and you typically never find those things, but you think, oh, well, I'll just put all that stuff down there because what if somebody has them? You're probably making it so that women are less likely to apply for those jobs. When you look at your interviewers, Do you have a diverse slate of interviewers? And do you have a diverse slate of interviewees, candidates, right? We know through some research that if we have only one female candidate who has made it to the interview stage, or one diverse candidate, the statistical chances of them being hired are very low. They just stand out too much, and we begin to compare them in ways that we wouldn't compare other candidates. So it's looking at, do I intentionally expand the way I interact and expand the way I recruit so that I can increase my talent pool to the types of people that I need in my business to make it more diverse and inclusive. The third area of behavior is, how are you encouraging and building a high-performing diverse team? Are managers being allies, advocates, mentors, and sponsors to people who are not like them? We recently saw some research and study done right around the time of Davos, and what managers, 75% of managers said that they typically mentor and sponsor people who are just like them. So if we're not encouraging performance in this way, those people are not getting the same opportunities. When we think about putting women in high-profile, challenging assignments, the types of assignments that actually help someone get to the senior level, when we look at why are women not progressing, I think a big part of it is they don't have the types of experiences that help them to get to those most senior roles. But what's happened along the way is that we have not thought about those women for those senior roles, or we've made a decision that they would not take that assignment. In other words, we've eliminated them before we even ask them. There are managers who will say to themselves, well, she would not want that overseas assignment, or she would not want this client engagement because it requires X, Y, and Z, and she has small kids at home. They may not consciously be saying that, but that's what they're thinking, and they're not putting the women in those assignments to have those experiences, to broaden their skill set, to be eligible for future opportunities. One more thing about encouragement. We often see that women need to be encouraged to apply for these jobs when they are internal candidates, just like I talked about a few minutes ago about women not applying for jobs as external candidates. So we often have to go to women on our team and say, hey, how come you haven't applied for this opportunity? You're not telling them that if they apply, they're going to get the job, nor are you going to give them the job just because they're going to apply, but you are saying to them, I think you're a strong candidate, and I think you should apply for this job. One of my clients is a global engineering firm, and a few months ago, I was in the cafeteria and saw two male leaders talking with a young female coworker about an opportunity, and I could overhear them talking about it, and she kept saying, no, I think I just need a little more experience before I can take this role. And they had been in a program that I had done, and they said, well, no, we think you should apply for the job. And she kept saying, no, I don't think I'm ready. And finally, they just said to her, look, we've been taught that we should really encourage you to apply. So we just want you to apply. And we don't really want to hear why you think you're not qualified, because we think you're qualified. And so they persisted, and she actually really did apply. So lastly, around engagement. Am I personally leading and engaging to drive diversity as a business outcome? Do I, as a manager and leader, interact in a leadership way around the initiatives that are happening in my company? A lot of businesses have employee resource groups for women, minorities, LGBT, and yet the people who are present there and engaged there are the people for whom that group is intended, but others are not. The men are not, or leaders are not. And these men and leaders don't feel like they have a place to play or a responsibility to be a part and leaders in that conversation. And so they have to be invited in. They have to understand what their role is, how they can engage, what they can do that will make a difference, and that their experiences and interactions matter. So in other words, if we have a women's employee resource group, we should have events where both men and women are present. We should have events where clients come and women can network and engage with our clients. We should open up the conversation so that everybody in the company is a part of it, and we're not going off somewhere talking about women's issues or diversity inclusion issues or racial issues or LGBT issues just amongst ourselves, that we're inviting others to be a part of the conversation and be leaders in that process. So I'm going to stop there and so that I can take some questions, if there are any, and to really dive deeper into any areas that you're interested in.
Thank you, Rania. That was extremely interesting. And like we were talking before we went on air, this is definitely a theme that's also very close to my heart and my passion. You have really great information. So thank you. And everybody, if you want to start posting your questions on the questions section, and I'll go through them one at a time, I invite you to do so. And I can go ahead with the first question in the meantime. It is based on what you've seen and in your experience, have you seen any difference in the numbers across some of the industries that maybe they're leading the way or making some important advancements, or is it more just across, the numbers are across the same, any industry?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say there's a particular industry that's made a lot more strides than other industries. It's interesting to me actually to note maybe the other side of that. Sometimes some industries claim, how great they are in terms of their diversity, efforts, and it's, the vast majority of people that work there are women, and they say, oh, well, we have 30% women in our leadership team when their employee base is 80% women. So I don't consider that, a big win. So I don't know that I can pinpoint a particular industry where we've seen significant strides. I think there are companies within certain industries making many more strides than others, and we're seeing that in terms of their profitability and their ability to fill their roles.
Okay. And then we have a question here from Hanan Hikal. I hope I said the name right. She's curious, how do business leaders respond to your question? What's the business case for the status quo, and what did they say?
Yeah, they're often taken aback by that question. And then as we begin to process that, question of, well, why what's the case for keeping things just the way they are, they begin to realize that it's not a very strong argument, right? And then that begins to reorder or reshape or reframe the conversation for them. And it's through that discussion is really rich. People obviously don't love the question when I first ask it, but if they will let themselves engage in it, then they begin to realize something. And I think for some industry and some cases, they will say, well, the status quo is just fine and we're a market leader and we're beating all the competition and our performance is fantastic. And you'll be able to have less of a case there. But what do we know about market leaders, right? It's very rarely that they stay the market leaders, and the young upstarts and who disrupt and view the business from a different perspective are the ones who then start eating away at the market share and then sometimes can disrupt the whole industry. Meanwhile, the market leader could be, asleep at the wheel because they're just thinking about the things they always know.
Okay. In your experience, just because I've heard this before, what are your thoughts on the few women that have reached C-level or very high executive roles, and it feels like they're not helping in trying to bring more women into the table for fear of it took me a lot to be able to get there, and maybe if more people row or get a seat on the table, they might just take mine. Any thoughts? Or have you?
I get asked that question a lot, and I don't experience or see that to the extent that it's discussed. So I think that more and more women are supporting more women and advancing other women and mentoring women. I think that we need to ask ourselves the question when we see that behavior of, is this woman acting this way because she's a woman, or she's just acting this way because that's how she is, and there are a lot of men who are not supportive of others and just want to advance themselves? Or is this woman in the senior role not helping this other woman because she doesn't think the other woman is performing? In other words, I think we conclude very quickly when we see the behavior that this action is because this woman doesn't want to lose her position or her standing, and we often see that it's actually something else. And I encourage women who find themselves, if they think they're not being supported by a senior woman, to talk to that woman about that and try to find out what's going on. But I don't think it's as widespread or prevalent of an issue as people want to talk about.
Yeah. We see a low number of female applicants for jobs, especially engineering roles. Apart from the job ad advice that you mentioned, which was great, do you have any other ideas or advice about how to encourage more female applicants or other ways to post and engage and attract?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things to do. Thinking about blind resumes is one. The job ads is two. Where you post the job ads, there are lots of women-centered job boards and job sites. I would definitely encourage that. Thinking about what are the organizations that women engineers belong to? And are you a part of those organizations in a significant way where you're getting to know women engineers? The fifth thing I would say is that the data shows us that women in STEM, 50% of them leave after 10 years, leave the field after 10 years. So 50% of women in STEM leave the field after 10 years of being in it. So it's also not just a matter of recruiting, but a matter of retention. And what I see in the businesses that I work in is they're actually doing an okay job recruiting, like, for example, on the college campuses and bringing women in, but they're not keeping the women who they've spent thousands of dollars training and building up, these women who are in the 5 to 7 year mark. And that has to do with how these women are being treated in the workplace, what kind of flexibility they have, what kind of environment there is. So I think that's another factor. And if your company can have the kind of reputation that it has a really inclusive, flexible, supportive environment, you should be able to recruit some of the women leaving women engineers leaving other companies.
That's great advice. And we have time just for one last question. The elephant in the room in the US is maternity leave and female representation in politics to push for the maternity leave agenda. Can you comment?
Agreed. And I think it's really holding us back. And equally important is paternity leave. We see that companies who have paternity leave actually make a bigger difference in stemming female turnover than just having a maternity leave. So it's looking really at both. And I can't really comment on where our country is moving in terms of the legal mandate around maternity leave, and paternity leave. But I think it's something that we need to work really hard for in the companies where we work. And to the extent that we can drive that agenda and really recommend and push for that in our own workplaces, I don't think we can keep waiting for the government to take action. I think we'll be waiting for too long.
Well, thank you very, very much, Rania. It was very, very interesting, everything that you shared with us today, and we appreciate very much your time. Any last words?
I just want to recap and say if you're not making progress in terms of bringing in a diverse workforce and having an inclusive environment, think back to the things I talked about, which are, does your company really know what it is it's working towards? Are you doing it in a strategic, integrated manner, or are you trying this tactic and that tactic and the other tactic? And then lastly, have you invited and equipped everyone in your company to be a part of that process? I think those are the three keys to success at this point. The hope and a prayer that things are just going to get better, or that the actions we are taking are going to result in a different outcome, are just not the case. It's proving to be that if we continue to do what we have been doing, we are not going to see the improvements that we want. There's maybe, and I'll just do this really quickly, I think we talk a lot about what's in it for the company, what's in it for women, what's in it for minorities to have a more inclusive workplace. I don't think we spend enough time talking about what's in it for men. How do they benefit? What is the impact on their careers? How do they personally improve and advance when we have a more diverse and inclusive workforce? And we've got to spend time talking about that. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and I appreciate you taking time and your questions, and feel free to reach out if I can be helpful in any way.
Thank you. And definitely it'll give us a lot of themes to continue to talk about, not only for men, but also, not only for women, but also for men. Thank you so, so much. Okay, so let me go back here to my screen. So a couple of quick closing announcements. All our webinars are recorded so that you can go back and review anything you want to listen to again or share with your friends via our P&G Alumni Network and YouTube channel. We also would love for you to get involved. Sign up for updates at the pngalums.com, support the foundation at pngalums.com foundation, and partner with us at pngalums.com/sponsor. You can also volunteer, start or join a chapter, or share any other thoughts at hello@pngalums.com. We'd love to hear from you anything that you would like to recommend so that we make this community a stronger and better one for ourselves and for our businesses. And thank you again for joining another exciting webinar. And this is your host, Ileana Rojas, and I wish you all a great rest of your day, wherever in the world you may be. Thank you for joining.